But I wanted to introduce Jessica Hanson. Jessica is the instructional coach at the Overlake School in Redmond, Washington. Before that, she was academic dean at University of Prep here also in Seattle. And what else can I tell you about awesome Jessica? Jessica has had, I don't know, how long have you been in education? Maybe I shouldn't.
Do I have to answer that truthfully? It makes
truthfully a very long time. And was a science teacher at first back in the day, and has done a lot of work with. She was part of opening a school in California at one time. She's had administrative roles. She's had teaching roles, and has really found. If I can just speak for you for just a quick second, like the student learning and teaching part of the job is what she's most passionate about. We, Jessica and I worked together for a year. I can't.
2 years.
We overlap for 2? Okay.
Maybe.
At the Overlake School, and I really just thought it would be great to hear from her on some topics around coaching as a systems change kind of element for professional learning at a school. And so we'll hear kind of a case study approach of how it works at Overlake, but also some questions just about how to empower teachers to have the ability to make change at their school. That's a question that came up recently in our coaching innovation course, and I thought Jessica would be a good person to talk to about that. As far as format, for those of you joining the call, please feel free to ask any questions. You can also use the little the Zoom chat to just post questions there, and then I'll see them and we can try to get to them as we go along. So we'll just start by, Jessica, just tell us a little bit about a typical day as an instructional coach for you.
Sure. I think one of the things I really like about being an instructional coach is that there isn't a typical day. I get to do lots of different things all over campus. And as the instructional coach here at Overlake, I'm probably the only person on this campus who has seen every single member of our teaching faculty in class. So the different other administrator type people, they'll see either their upper school teachers or their middle school teachers, or the department heads will see people in their department. But I get to interact with everyone, which makes the job really interesting. So on a typical day, I'll see anywhere between like 1 and 4 classes for formal observations of teachers I'm working with. I'll have debrief meetings after those observations with teachers. And I do a lot of research for teachers in terms of things that we're working on. So I don't claim to be an expert in, say, computer science. That's not my background. But if I'm working with a teacher who is looking for resources or teaching ideas or trying to figure out how best to engage kids in that course, then I have the luxury of time to dig in and do a lot of that initial learning and sort of synthetic thinking to share with teachers back in that way. Then I sit in a lot of meetings with other people and department chairs and everything else, which is the less interesting part of the job.
And what does a coaching cycle look like, and how do you guys sort of organize and structure this program at Overlake?
Sure. When I first got to Overlake, the thought was that we would run 4 coaching cycles a year, 1 for each quarter, because we're on a quarter semester system. And it became really clear that that was not a great model, because when teachers hit those hot spots in the calendar year, primarily around grading and comment writing, nobody has the bandwidth for coaching. So we pretty quickly scrapped that model. And what I do now is follow, for lack of, a better, cleaner break, our 3 athletic seasons, because those tend to fall in the middle of grading periods, not at the ends. And so it frees up teacher mental space. It also actually works really well for our teachers who are coaches, because to be coaching themselves and being coached is overwhelming. They just don't have the time and the space. So when I break it up by fall, winter, and spring athletic seasons, that's really the way to go. The sessions last about 8 to 10 weeks, and we run an 8-day rotating schedule here. So what I tell teachers is they should expect to have a meeting with me at least one block out of that 8-day cycle, and then to plan on having me in their classroom observing an additional block out of that 8-day cycle. So that's sort of the time frame of it. In terms of how the sessions are structured, I start every coaching cycle with a one-on-one meeting that's really about establishing trust and rapport and getting some background information on the teacher as a learner, how they view themselves as a teacher, their hopes, dreams, fears about instructional coaching. And we have a preliminary goal setting conversation, which then launches us into the second meeting, which is really defining the goal, starting an action plan, et cetera.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you get, so you said you've gone through the whole faculty has been coached at least once at this point. What about those that might have been less interested in being coached? How did you work with those teachers to kind of, help them? And
so our model here is everybody has to be coached, but they can choose sort of when it happens with a sort of final deadline of like, this is the last coaching cycle. So if you're not in it now, you better get in there. And there are definitely people who held off until the end. For whatever reason, they were not super interested in this whole project. But the first thing I was really sure to make happen was that the coaching meeting I had with them was not the first time I ever talked to them, worked with them, saw them teach. So that there was already some establishment of a relationship with these people. The way I coach is very much relational. And so it's easier for me to work with people if they know me a little bit and don't think I'm totally like bonkers when I walk into their room the first time. It also really helps if they have had colleagues that they trust who've been through a coaching cycle already that can talk to them about what it's really about. A lot of the resistance I see to coaching is really a resistance to having someone sort of peek under the hood of their teaching. Because teaching is super personal and tied in many ways to our identities. And when you're working with a teacher as a coach, they're opening up some pieces of their practice that maybe they've never shown to other people other than kids before. Mm-hmm. If it's the planning and back, outside the classroom stuff, maybe no one has seen that for a really long time. So, you have to be really compassionate when you're a coach, in my opinion. And the pieces that I remind myself all the time, sometimes I have them actually written on my whiteboard in my office, are compassion, humility, and genuine inquiry, right? I don't ask gotcha questions when I coach. That's not going to help with any of this. And it's going to take those people who are reluctant and continue to leave them reluctant, or, move from reluctant to hostile. And that's never good.
So one of the things I think that's interesting about Overlake is that the school as a whole was supportive of instructional coaching as a model, right? From the beginning, as a way to improve professional development across the board. Like how that process happened probably before you came, but even though you came in with that as like the norm, what are some of the things that you've had to face as challenges in that role of kind of like, if coaching is a form of professional development, can you talk a little bit about how you've had to, are there barriers you've still had to kind of overcome at the school level, and what are they, and that sort of thing?
Sure. I think if you were to ask the faculty, the piece that they would say is the biggest barrier is time. And sometimes I think time becomes a surrogate because it's an easy answer to explain why something else is hard. We don't have the time. I think part of it is teachers who don't actually know how or what they want to improve. So the early coaching cycles I had with people, those early adopters were hard charging, and they had there are like 15 things in my teaching that I would like to think about and work on. And those are, generally speaking, easier people to work with, although you have to force them to focus a little bit because they can't do 15 things all at once. As you move to the later people, some of them are reluctant because they don't actually know what they don't know. And that's, I spend a lot of time with those people trying to refine what it is they're doing. Sometimes I'll videotape them so they can watch themselves teach first before we set a teaching and learning goal for our coaching cycle, so that they can start to have a slightly more critical eye about what's happening in their classrooms. Yeah. Other pieces that are sort of evolving now for us, I now have a second coach who I work with, and she focuses specifically on instructional coaching with the use of technology. And we now are in charge of vetting and approving all faculty PD requests so that we can start to tie faculty professional development to areas of growth in classes, rather than some of the more sort of vague PD requests that we have gotten maybe in the past.
I didn't ask you this, but it's non-evaluative, right? So this is not, their coaching isn't part of an evaluation process, right, as a teacher?
Right. So the two division heads, the upper school division head and the middle school division head, do the evaluations of their faculty. The coaching is purely developmental, not evaluative. The piece that's kind of interesting in that is that sometimes in an evaluation cycle, the division head will see something that the teacher needs to improve on, and then they will suggest that that person comes to work with us. So you get people that way as well who come in maybe not with a goal that they had originally thought of themselves, but with one that was pointed out to them by their evaluator.
And is that still a confidential kind of relationship, even if it's someone that's been referred to you?
Yes. So coaching, the way we do it is completely confidential, other than the standard mandated reporting requirements that we have. And what I tell everybody in that first coaching meeting is that coaching is confidential, other than mandated reporter things. If I see something as a coach that looks off and seems like it's part of a serious issue in someone's classroom that I feel needs to go to a division head, I will tell the teacher I'm working with that I'm going to do that, and I will invite that teacher to come with me in that conversation. And I've never had to do either of those things. I'll just say that.
Yeah. The other thing that I'm curious about is just like some of the joy that you get out of doing this work. You talked a little bit about some of the challenges, but what's joyful about the experience of being a coach?
I think there is nothing better really than working with a teacher to help make a class better for kids and to improve student outcomes, right? That's a gift I get every day that I sit down and have a conversation with a teacher. It's also, I think, a great job for someone who likes to think broadly about teaching and learning. When I was a science teacher, which I loved, I spent a lot of time thinking about science and a lot of time thinking about science pedagogy. Maybe I didn't spend as much time thinking about writing instruction. Now I get to think about all kinds of pieces. I can spend a day, I'll be in like a 5th grade PE class in the morning and an AP Latin class 2 hours later. And I can see both the differences in how the pedagogy of that works, but I also see a lot of similarities, right? I'm much more grounded in just fundamental principles of what good teaching looks like, no matter what size kid, no matter what subject. There are some commonalities and fundamentals.
That's really cool. What advice would you have for people that are interested in maybe starting a coaching program at their school, but they are among, a few that might think this is a good idea, and there's administrators that are like, what is coaching and why would I want to invest money and time into this?
Mm-hmm. I think there are a couple of ways you can approach that. One of them, if you're talking to administrators, is economic, quite honestly. Coaching is in some ways more cost effective if you're looking for long-term teacher change in behavior than sending someone to a one-off conference every year or sending a couple of people to one-off conferences. Because a lot of what we do as teachers becomes habitual, and changing habit doesn't happen when you go get inspired by hearing an amazing speaker in some interesting place. Those PD experiences are super useful in a lot of ways for a lot of things, but I'm not 100% sure how well they convert to change in classroom. So, that's one way to think about it. I sometimes call myself like the educational dental hygienist because,
that's terrible.
They're awful, but like teachers know that I'm going to come see them, and it's just that added bit of accountability for what they needed to do that week. Because no one wants to say, I didn't do my homework, or I didn't floss, or I didn't, think in this, I didn't follow through on this conversation we had last week about teaching and learning in my classroom. So that's one way. I think another way to get schools to change is to find your posse. And it is really hard to change a school culture as an individual. The more people you can get to speak your language and have those conversations and spread the word and spread the ideas, the stronger your position will be as a change agent. And that's true of not just coaching. I think that's true of everything. I'm now working on an SEL initiative here at school that if it were just me would be way harder to move forward than the 6 or 8 people we started with that then has become 20 that is rolling into more and more, so that you can snowball your ideas.
Yeah.
SEL is social emotional learning.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other question I was thinking about when you were talking is the idea that when you were saying that it's very difficult to change a culture on one person. I mean, that's also like within the school. What are some of the ways that you can connect, or you have connected with other folks that are doing similar work across different school communities?
Sure. Instructional coaching is interesting because there's been a lot of work in instructional coaching in the public schools. A lot less traditionally has been happening in independent schools. And I'm not sure where all of you are teaching and if you're all independent school people or what. But certainly in Seattle, there aren't that many coaches who existed, say, 4 years ago when I came to Overlake. So part of it is finding the people who do this work, even if their job title isn't instructional coach, because lots of schools will have someone who does some pieces of this without having that as a job title. And the way we find each other, or have found each other here at least, is through just who do we know at other schools. So I am part of a group of 4 instructional coaches. We meet once a month to talk about our practice, which is super important for us since we're each, until recently, have been the only instructional coach at our schools. And with confidentiality, it's hard to problem solve sometimes if you're the only person at your school who does your job. And the way we found each other was two instructional coaches met at a conference, and then we're talking to their school heads who said, oh, I have an instructional coach, I'll put you in touch with them. And then another division head said, oh, I just heard about this group of instructional coaches that meet. Why don't you, sign in and see if you can get hooked up with them? And so the 4 of us, actually Kristen was involved with it in the early days. We started a roundtable series for any teacher in our area who does this work, whether they're called instructional coach or not, and wants to come together to talk and learn about coaching principles. So we do that 3 times a year now, and it's open to anybody and everybody, and we advertise it. And in that way, those people are also now making their connections with coaches outside of their schools, and creating a network, if you will.
Yeah, that's cool. Have you ever coached any of the administrators?
Not in an official capacity, but I do use the principles I apply to instructional coaching often in my meetings with them. At its heart, instructional coaching is about listening to someone, asking questions to help facilitate their thinking, and sort of being witness to their growth and learning, and providing what expertise you have along the way because you're someone who's spent some time thinking about these ideas and issues.
Yeah.
But I spend a lot of time in conversation with people, just helping them clarify their thinking, which actually works at home too with my 13-year-old daughter.
Yeah.
I use a lot of the same questioning and listening and paraphrasing techniques.
Michael just asked a question. Actually, Michael, why don't you go ahead and just say it out loud?
Sure. Hey, Jessica. I'm sorry I was late. I love what you're doing, and I like how this is, a role that's increasingly growing at schools. In New York, I started morphing from like a curriculum coach and then started to live in the technology world, which was always like this current that we as technologists were like pushing against, which was that we were living in the tech department. Are you finding that those folks at schools are being seen more as instructional coaches, or is there still a division between you're the tech people and we're the right? Are you seeing that blur a little bit more?
Certainly here at Overlake, it is. When we hired what I think in the past would have been called a tech integrator kind of position, we rewrote it. And so the job is actually instructional coach for technology. And so we put the coaching piece first. And the job description, and as we posted it, was what you would see typically in an instructional coaching job. And then it had some tech elements folded in. So we're now in the process of helping everybody on campus understand the difference between tech coach versus tech help versus, whatever else people need. And so we're working through that as a rollout of this new job. But it's really a great way to help people see that we care about teaching and learning. Tech is a part of that, but it's not about like bells and whistles and clicking buttons. It's about curriculum design. It's about thinking about deeper questions in assessment and the role of technology in that, et cetera. I was just at the Teaching, Learning, Coaching Conference in the end of September, and there are an increasingly number of tech people there who are starting to think of their jobs as coaches rather than integrators.
Yeah.
So are you saying there's a separate role? There's a tech instructional coach for technology who is sort of not in your department?
So our instructional
alongside.
So she double reports to the coaching program, but also to the tech side. But in terms of her approach, she is moving people more and more towards tech in a coaching capacity. We have other people in the tech department who troubleshoot, various and sundry issues or can answer basic help questions so that it frees her up to do more of the teaching and learning.
Yeah, and I think this seems to be a trend. Would you guys, those of you that are on the call, that folks, tech departments are starting to really evaluate what their roles are, and that, and blurring the lines more between pedagogy, best practices in teaching and learning, and getting more away from the fact that they're just tech support, but it's hard. This is, especially when we're going back to kind of like culture change and shift, it takes time for folks to understand that this is a different way of using a department that may have been thought of as, I can't figure out how to get a Google Doc opened, and instead let's talk, why are we using Google for this? Those kinds of things. So, the idea that culture shift takes a while. And I think you now, you're in your 4th year, is that right?
Yep.
As an instructional coach. How have you seen the role of coaching evolve in the time that you've been there, or the role of professional growth, I would say, is a broader question, in the time you've been at Overlake?
I will say that, and I don't know if it's, how much is because of having an instructional coaching program versus the trajectory of the institution that allowed us to start an instructional coaching program. So it's sort of a chicken and egg thing in that sense. But we have a lot more conversations about what we do publicly. We collaborate a lot more. I see more cross-departmental work happening, and it's just changing the way we think about how these conversations happen everywhere on campus, at lunch, in the faculty room, which is not to say that people didn't collaborate and talk to each other before coaching happened, but the habit formation of just sharing your practice is much more ingrained in what we do now. And I will say, but with respect to the instructional coach for technology, it's becoming clear to people in their work with her that it's coaching first. So we use the same protocols. We ask the same kinds of questions. We approach our sessions with teachers very similarly to help drive that point home, that this is not about the tool itself, but why are we using this tool? Is there, what's the question we're asking kids? How does this thing allow us to push the boundaries on assessment, for instance, or, connecting people in various ways?
And in that way of connection, how has coaching worked in that? You talked a little bit about the interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary collaboration. How has that kind of happened at Overlake?
Sure. I think, it's as teachers started to collaborate more intentionally and talk more amongst themselves, it gave them the opportunity to say, oh, that's something you're interested in. That's something I'm interested in too. So we're in different departments. Oh, well, maybe we can figure out ways to bring our interests and our joint needs together. So the other piece that I do to help facilitate that work is help those teachers have those kinds of conversations So right now I'm working with a teacher in the fine arts department and a physics teacher who are going to be co-teaching a class next year. And so I'm helping them come from these different places to facilitate what is the course about and how are we thinking about it and what techniques and teaching methods do you bring from each of your disciplines and how do you want to meld those. And so a lot of that kind of coaching work I do is really group facilitation.
And you guys have PLCs as well, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And are those teacher-led?
Those are teacher-led. So we're going to have, I think, 4 starting in January this year. And part of the teacher leading of PLCs is a way to give teachers some leadership experience as well. So they will meet with me to practice facilitation techniques and learn about working with adults, which then they will bring to their role as PLC facilitators.
Oh, that's great. I'm looking at Ayoko, your question. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask Jessica? Yeah, go ahead, Ayoko.
Just curious, when you work with faculty over time and what the closure typically looks like. Do you always have a clean ending? Like say, oh, you are comfortable, off you go, or is it always like keep working on it and then you will end up like your goal, your support kind of keeps piling up? How does it look like?
That is super dependent on the teacher and what it is they're working on in their practice. So some people need some really concrete help at implementing a strategy, for instance. Once I help them through that, like that could be a pretty clean ending to what we're working on. Classroom management is an example of that. Other teachers are working on bigger kinds of ideas, like how to create a more student-centered teaching or classroom. Right? We could all be working on that forever. The way I typically close a session with a teacher is I have a final meeting and I ask 3 questions usually. One is related to, did this work meet the goal you set in terms of student outcome? So when I'm working with teachers to set goals, it's always with student outcome in mind. Another one is, what is your plan moving forward to build on this work that you've begun here? And then the last question is, what continuing support do you need from me as an instructional coach? And for some people, they'll say, it would be great if you would check in with me once a month just to have a quick conversation to see how this is going. Some people would like, if you see professional development materials coming along on this subject, it would be great. Some people, their answer is, I'm not done yet, and I still need to stay in a coaching cycle.
That's awesome.
And so sometimes I do keep people for, 6 months rather than 10 weeks.
That's the title of your book, Jessica, I think. Yeah. Well, that's great. Does anyone else have any other questions for Jessica? We're about 9:35 here in Seattle. Anybody? Make sure I'm looking at everyone's face.
I'm curious about whether you end up recommending tech tools and becoming, do you end up sort of teaching people how to use new tools, or do you avoid that?
So certainly before we had our second instructional coach on campus, I would work with people around technology ideas. I was less involved in teaching people the tools themselves and the button pushing than there is this thing out there that I think would be really useful to you. A lot of it had to do with our learning management system and different pieces of it that would be interesting or helpful for teachers to use in their classes. And at that point, I would often have the preliminary conversations with teachers. We'd walk through, these are the kinds of things you want to do. Here are the questions you need to ask. And I would send them then straight to the tech department to get the button pushing stuff taken care of. With our new instructional coach for technology, there's actually sort of a cleaner differentiation between what I do as an instructional coach and what she does as a tech coach. And she still will walk them through all of those teaching and learning questions, but will do a little more of the sitting beside with the machine to then show them how to do it as well.
Yeah, because I think at the same time you came on, they introduced Canvas. So it's a, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I've done a lot of what we now call tech coaching over the years before we had a tech coach.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, you go.
I have two more because
good,
it's so valuable to talk to someone who is already in the role. So I'm just curious. I guess one is, you mentioned the content expertise, and then I understand it. I'm a language teacher. I have I don't have that expertise in math or history. But as a teacher, I also am aware of my weakness. Say, classroom management is not my strongest, and yet sometimes you have to work with that. Does an instructor coach have to be a perfect teacher? Like, how do you? Do this job? It's one question. The other is, in secret, how can I approach classroom observation without, them feeling judged? I think it's very hard for them not to feel judged when somebody walks into the classroom.
Sure. In terms of your first question, no, you don't have to know everything about everything. Like, that's not possible. Part of it is, I think, going into coaching yourself with a mindset of growth, because you will be learning right alongside your teachers. What you're bringing as a coach then is some expertise in terms of how to frame thinking about teaching and learning, how to help people become more metacognitive themselves about their practice. Because, ideally, we want to coach ourselves out of jobs, in a sense. Like, we want to have it so that teachers can think about what they're doing, assess what they're doing, and start to figure out how to move forward. Now, there will always be a need for that mirror person in schools and in classrooms, but to the extent that we can give teachers those skills to start down that way themselves of becoming reflective practitioners, that's a lot of what coaching is. And then I'm sorry, I can't remember now your second question.
Oh, the judgment.
Oh, sure, the judgment. I think that is a lot about how you build trust and rapport in those early conversations and meetings. People laugh at me, but I always tell them, like, my job is not to be judgy McJudgment when we sit down together. And they laugh, but I think it sticks as well. When I observe a teacher, I tend to take just a transcript of what is happening in class. And at some point, if you're interested, we can talk offline about how I actually take notes and do class observations. But to the extent possible, I just keep a running transcript that is time-stamped. And I don't put into those notes embedded in there my thoughts and judgments about what's happening. I keep those separate. And then when I sit down to talk to teachers about their class, I very deliberately ask them to speak first. Every single teacher I work with knows that the first question I'm going to ask them is, how did it go today? And what went well, and what would you change if you could do it again? It's their class. They need to own it. And, I find it, for me at least, it's respectful to let them then have the first crack at deconstructing what happened. And yeah.
Do you take all the themes and the things that you're seeing in classrooms and the conversations that you're having with teachers and look for the threads that might tie that together to create larger professional learning opportunities? And how does that work if that's the case?
Yeah, it's funny that you should ask that. For about a year and a half on my whiteboard, I had something that was called through lines. And every time I would see something that showed up across campus in various ways, I would just start this running list of through lines. I use it so I meet monthly with all the department chairs, and we have a group meeting. And so sometimes it comes up there as we're talking about what is happening on campus. I also meet with the division heads and the head of school to talk about what kinds of professional development we would like school-wide, and it comes up there as well as we're trying to plan sort of the
And Kristen, I think you're muted,
PD
at least in my world.
on campus.
No, and in my world too.
Okay.
Yeah. Jessica, any final thoughts for folks, like as far as resources, things that they, if they're interested in looking into how to establish a coaching program at their school, what would you recommend as a place to start?
So there are a lot of sort of journal articles and things that I've pulled together over time because as you might imagine, as instructional coaching has been gaining more traction in independent schools, people ask me a lot what I would recommend that they read or have their administrators read to get it together. For individual coaching practitioners, I really like Elena Aguiar's book, The Art of Coaching. She's also got a new one out on coaching teams, both of which I use a lot. From a systems perspective, or if you're trying to get a program started at your school, like you've got the commitment, but you don't know structurally how to do it, there's a book called Coaching Matters that walks you through step by step as an institution. It's even got, it gets so granular as to ask, like, here are some questions you might ask a potential coach in a job interview to get towards some people that would be appropriate for you. And then Jim Knight out of the Kansas Coaching Project has quite a bit of stuff that comes out in the Journal of Staff Development, which is now called Learning Forward magazine, that talks in sort of shorter, more digestible chunks about coaching. And if you're interested, Kristen, I can send you my standard resource list that I just push out to people.
Sure, that would be great. Can send it to everyone. Well, I want to say thank you, Jessica. This was really wonderful. It's also just fun these are conversations Jessica and I used to have in between like classes and during lunch when we could. So it's been fun to just take some time to reflect and have these like kind of bigger conversations about coaching. And thanks all of you for joining. I will send up, once Jessica sends those resources, I'll send those out to everyone in faculty Slack and in the Learning Design Coaches Slack. So thanks a lot. And thank you, Jessica, for spending the last 45 minutes with us.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Take care. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye, everybody.